Good morning. My name is Amanda Dalmeda,
I'm Nathan Lamb.
and the title of the performance is Caught in a Net of Debate.
Using diplomacy to interpret treaty rights.
May I please begin? Samolskiak, Hoan, salmon. Whatever name you give us, we have been the center of debate since the white man settled the Northwest. From the beginning of time, we the salmon have made the same journey every generation. Though we have never changed our ways of life, we have been the cause of great conflict and debate among people and cultures. The use of diplomacy in the form of a treaty between the Northwest Native Americans and Isaac Stevens, the territorial governor of Washington and representative for the United States government, was the basis of this conflict for years to come.
The right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians, in common with all citizens of the territory. I, Isaac Stevens, promise the natives this right to ensure their signature to this treaty, acknowledging the savages' freedom to hunt and fish or preserve their way of life, will not affect our settlers, allow us to take their land under government control.
We were not a source of profit for the white man at first, but over time we began to see our value. This consequence resulted in a new debate between the natives and the white settlers over our runs. Although treaty rights supersede the Constitution and become the supreme law of the land, arguments flared between a sundry of groups over the Native American ways of life, especially concerning fishing. For the white settlers, we were a means for making a living. For the Native Americans, we were integral to the way of life. This was especially true for the Muckleshoot Puyallup, and particularly a man by the name of Billy Frank Jr., who was a member of the Nisqually tribe.
Hello there. You must be Billy Frank Jr. I'm Hank Adams.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Hank. I hear you've come all the way from eastern Montana to help us with our fishing rights.
That's right. I'm happy to be of service. Our National Indian Youth Council realizes President Eisenhower has made this fishing debate drastically more difficult through the termination-era legislation. The government has broken their promise, now making it illegal for us to practice our traditions and customs.
Yes, this means we can no longer speak our native language or perform our rituals. Our children must integrate into public white schools, cut their hair, and wear uniforms. In addition, because the salmon is a sacred part to our traditional ceremonies and cultures, they have taken away our right to fish off reservation. This essentially will dilute our culture by forcing us into the white ways.
Billy, I'll help raise awareness in order for your culture to be restored.
Once Eisenhower's legislation had been passed, it became legal to arrest Native Americans for fishing off reservation, no matter what the treaty had once promised. However, believing it was their right, tribes rebelled by continuing traditional fishing.
Billy, I understand your fishing rights are an important part of the Nisqually way of life.
Yes, the salmon are a part of the life cycle and sacred to the tribes. There is a relationship between our life and the salmon. They have provided us not only with food, but they keep our culture alive.
I understand, but the white man, do they not share the same perspective?
I don't believe they understand or care about the importance of the salmon to us, or the rights we have to them through the treaty they signed. Now the salmon runs are decreasing, and they blame us. The irony of this is that Native Americans in Washington state take less than 5% of the fish. We have lived in harmony with the land for as long as our people have existed, and the salmon population has never been threatened until the settlers came.
Yes. Billy, we must raise awareness for organizing fish-ins, fishing illegally where the public can witness the state's actions against us.
Hank Adams began organizing fish-ins, and also recruited famous celebrities Marlon Brando and Dick Gregory to help with their cause. As a means of diplomacy, the governor of Washington State, Dan Evans, created the Washington State Indian Affairs Commission in 1967. And for the first time, tribal leaders had the opportunity to interact with the government in a direct and formal way. Unfortunately, this attempt at diplomacy did not resolve the major conflict. The sport and commercial fishermen felt that the natives should abide by the same laws. Debate began to become more heated, which led to violent riots and arrests.
The state is strictly regulating fishing because the salmon runs are thinning, and yet the natives complain. Closing off certain rivers of fishing, even if it is the natives' usual and accustomed grounds. Forcing everyone to have licenses, and banning gear such as gill nets is only fair. It is not right for two different sets of rules to exist because they are also citizens of the United States.
Hey, you got thrown in here too?
Yes, these fishings are really getting us noticed.
I agree. But are all these arrests really fair? This makes 40 times myself for simply living the life as my ancestors did before me. The other day, the Warrens ran their speedboat into my canoe. They tipped me out into the water and seized my boat.
That's terrible, but I do believe we're catching the media's attention. The federal government will soon realize the wrongs Washington State is committing. To deny rights promised under treaty is unconstitutional.
My people. In 1855, the territorial governor of Washington, Isaac Stevens, promised us that as long as the river runs, as long as the tide flows, and as long as the sun shines, you have land, fish, and game for your frying pans. This was promised to us, but this promise has been broken. The state is denying us these rights. In 1970, the Native Americans did gain the attention of the federal government, which led to the United States filing a lawsuit against Washington for breaking the treaty. Judge George Hugo Bolt of the District Court of the Western District of Washington was assigned this case. Many questions were to be answered. What's a treaty worth? Do Indians have special rights? What did the language in the treaty mean, and how did the tribes understand it when it was signed? It seemed that the whole debate hinged on one sentence of the treaty: the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory. On February 12, 1974, Judge Bolt came to a decision that would change fishing for many years to come.
Through diplomatic means, I have concluded that Native Americans are allotted 50% of the harvestable salmon runs because the treaty clearly states, in common with. In 1854, this would have been perceived as an equal share. The state has police power, as stated in Puyallup 1, to regulate off-reservation fishing, but only to the extent reasonable and necessary for the conservation of the resources.
By deciding that the state could regulate off-reservation fishing only if tribes failed to self-regulate or follow the conservation laws, Bolt cleverly gave back Native rights while honoring prior Supreme Court rulings. Finally, Bolt left this case open in order to resolve specific, undetermined questions collaboratively, extending the diplomatic tone set by pretrial agreements.
Treaties with Indian tribes must be construed liberally, in accordance to the meaning they were understood to have by tribal representatives at the Treaty Council, and in a spirit which generously recognizes the full obligation of this nation to protect the interests of the dependent people.
This decision was a monumental success for the Native Americans, but a failure for the white fishermen. They believed they were cheated and disagreed with the Bolt decision. To regulate the 50-50 allocation, Judge Bolt hired Richard Whitney as chairman of the Fishery Advisory Board to mediate the debate between all sides. Through diplomacy, 70 to 80% of these cases were resolved without the need of going to court. By tightly monitoring the salmon runs, the state was able to regulate the amount of fish harvested and learn the real reason behind our decimation. Pollution, dams, and overexploitation were found to be the critical factors.
Bolt's better dead than alive. How could only 1% of our population be going to 50% of the fish? Bolt's decision has slashed our incomes by drastically shortening the fishing season. The Native Americans are using tradition as an excuse to gain more income through fishing. It always comes down to money. Furthermore, there are natives taking advantage of these rights. For example, in the Skagit River, natives caught significantly more fish than they could use and left the excess floating dead in the river. Bolt was wrong in making the decision that he did, and it's only right to question his sanity.
Washington State refused to abide by this law and appealed this decision. Finally, in 1979, this case was brought to the Supreme Court, with Slade Gordon representing the state of Washington. The Supreme Court ruled in the Native Americans' favor, claiming it was an unmistakably clear decision.
Finally, our rights and liberties have been recognized by our country. We have successfully kept our culture alive.
This debate started through the misinterpretations of the treaty signed in 1854. Throughout the conflict, diplomacy was seen in action. And since the Bolt decision, Billy Frank Jr. has used his diplomatic skills by bringing together the main players in the state in order to restore the salmon population. It was of utmost importance to save us because we are a keystone species that maintain ecological balance in the Puget Sound region. Although some citizens still deem the Bolt decision a failure, it has paved the way for Native Americans to gain back rights throughout the nation, such as in the Great Lakes in 1997. The Bolt decision also had a worldwide impact on Native rights, ranging from Canada to Australia. Yet, the greatest consequence of the Bolt decision is that we, the salmon, the Smolskiak, the Hoan, were safe from extinction, and that America, as a nation, learned the power of a promise.
Okay, so I was looking at all the different interviews that you did and wondering how it all kind of came together for you as you were hearing some very divergent viewpoints on what happened and how you were able to kind of navigate to spell it out clearly here.
Yes, we had interviews from all different sides of the debate, starting with Governor Van Evans, who was the governor at that time, and he really gave us the broad perspective of the Boldt decision, and he really outlined it for us because he, at the time, didn't think it was necessarily the right decision, but now he realizes that the consequence is that the salmon population was saved, and he was the first one to really bring that to our minds, that the salmon population was saved through the Boldt decision. And then we interviewed Slade Gordon, who was his attorney general, and he had a totally opposite opinion and believed that there was no good consequences that came out of it. But we interviewed Billy Frank Jr. and Hank Adams, and the first time we met Billy Frank Jr., he hadn't ever spoken to us ever, and he came up and gave us a big hug, and he's like, "It's so great to meet you guys." And so it was great interviewing him, and they gave us stories and all this. And then sport and commercial fishermen we also interviewed. And then Richard Whitney, who gave us a perspective during the trial because he was pretty much Boldt's second-hand man. And although there was many different perspectives and we got different opinions from everyone, we narrowed it down to find our opinion and what we thought the consequences of the Boldt decision were and what really happened throughout the conflict.
Tell us a little bit about the process of how you were able to contact all of these important sources. Isn't every day you talk to the ex-government, for whatever reason?
Well, we actually just were doing some background research, and we found the important names like Billy Frank Jr. and Hank Adams, who were the face of Billy Frank Jr. was the face of a warrior, and Hank Adams really put the fissions together and made it publicly noticed. And so we read about them, and so then we kind of started looking up and trying to find some of their contact information, and we actually would just through Billy Frank Jr. and Hank Adams, we had email correspondence, and we were able to set up a date and time to go over and go to their school actually on the reservation and interview them personally. And then where Dan Evans, we called him up and we were able to set up an interview with him, and same with Slade Gordon, and they were actually all pretty willing to let us interview them and give us a lot of information, and it was really helpful for our project. Yeah,
we figured out either where they worked, and Billy Frank Jr. now works for the NWIC, Northwest Indian Affairs Commission. And so he works to save the salmon population, and we found where he worked, and then we emailed him. And then also we just Googled Dan Evans' name, and then we found him in White Pages, and we called him up. And actually first we called this team they gave us. They were really helpful, and if you need any questions, call us back again. And so then we got an interview through them.
Tell me about the symbolism you're using. Obviously, you used this mask, and where did that idea come from for doing that, as well as some of the props that you had, where they came from?
Well, because there were so many opinions that we got, the salmon wasn't the one with an opinion. They were ultimately the ones, they just wanted to be saved. And so we chose the salmon so that it wouldn't be a biased opinion on our topic. And so then we
and we also use fishermen or commercial fishermen, and then we also had the natives, and so we had tried to integrate all sides of the debate into our performance to kind of give a perspective of each individual and how they view the decision, so we could really portray each part of it and make it so we're not kind of being biased about one or the other and giving a full rounded idea for.
You were removing the buoys there. Was there something to that, or
those were the dates? So we started off in 1855, where Isaac Stevens kind of started the initial treaty, Medicine Creek Treaty, and that's where the conflict kind of started. As they lasted for many years with that treaty, but then as the salmon population kind of started to decimate, then there was conflict over who necessarily gets these salmon, and so that's where it all started. And then the Boldt decision was 1994. Yes, sorry, 1974. I'm sorry. And so then we kind of just tried to put those up to give an idea of what time frame this was in.
The whole debate essentially started with diplomacy in 1854 through the treaties, and then there was diplomacy used throughout the whole conflict up until now, because they still use diplomacy through everyone in the state, like the sport, commercial fishermen, and the government, and the natives, to all come together to decide how to save the salmon population. And so throughout the whole thing, diplomacy was used, starting in 1854, and there was also many debates with different trials and such on the salmon fish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.